You know, a few years ago, playing modern games on a handheld was a bit simpler. I had a single option, the Nintendo Switch. And if I wanted to take the games with me, my choice was to basically buy it on Switch or not have it at all. Even with the rise of cloud gaming, there's nothing quite like playing on a dedicated gaming machine, especially in terms of reliability. But now, I have this monster of a device, and generally have to decide, do I now buy the game for Switch or on Steam? For some folks, that's an easy question to answer, but there are legitimate reasons to buy a given game on either of these platforms. And I have a feeling it's only going to get harder over time, as more games I want to play come out on both platforms. Hell, the next few years might even bring a Switch successor or a Steam Deck Part 2, which puts even this impressive handheld to shame. So let's take a moment to really compare these two machines and consider why each might be the best damn handheld around at any given point in time. First off, let's address the elephant in the room. The Steam Deck and the Switch are both very different machines. One's a laptop crammed into a more portable case, the other's a home console with a rechargeable battery. Both play games, but in different ways. And the reason why so many people likely bring up the Switch in the same sentence as the Steam Deck is likely just due to the fact that the Nintendo Switch is one of the most popular consoles of all time, it's current, and if you squint hard enough, you can kind of see some vague similarities. However, it's also important to note that both of these devices are respectively the most performant gaming machines at their, surprisingly, low price ranges. After all, you can grab a used Switch Lite right now for around $150 and still play some of the most recent games on the market. That's a price usually reserved for lightweight retro handhelds or bargain bin smartphones. Meanwhile, the Steam Deck undercuts even the closest competition in the handheld PC space, while churning out the performance of devices over 3 times its price tag. In that sense, it makes sense for folks shopping at the lower end of the market to consider buying a Switch, Steam Deck, or even both, because they're just that reasonably positioned and can collectively play most of the newly released games. So is there anything that makes one better than the other at any given gameplay experience? Could someone feasibly choose one over the other without regrets? You probably have some ideas in mind already, but let's get the obvious ones out of the way. First, if you want to play first-party Nintendo games, you need a Switch. Likewise, if you want to play PC games that haven't been ported to the Switch, a Steam Deck will likely have better compatibility. To say one system is better than the other for the sake of their exclusives is kinda like asking if you want to play Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring. You can generally gauge which one sounds preferable to you, but it's easy to see how someone else might choose differently. Unless you're way past the point of being far too emotionally involved in either game. But, you might say, couldn't you just emulate Switch games on a Steam Deck anyway? To which I'd respond, you'd need to buy the games to get the ROM though, right? I mean, you wouldn't pirate a video game, would you? Well, anyway, let's say you happen to randomly find some Switch ROMs that fell out of a truck. While emulation, in general, on the Steam Deck is miles beyond the advancements made so far on the Switch, this isn't a case where software emulation is at a point that's better than original hardware. If you can think of an exclusive Switch game, it's likely going to be easier to run, feels like a smoother experience, and have more features on a Switch than when emulated on any other computer. Still, again, for other types of emulation, the Steam Deck is generally going to be better. It's just the Switch has a beat for Switch games. Right now, at least. And As a last super easy point, if you want to use your gaming machine for something other than gaming, there's really no competition here. Unless you're willing to install Android on your Switch, gaming is really all it does. Whereas the Steam Deck is a more general purpose computer for anyone who wants to tinker a bit. That's not really a knock on the Switch though. After all, its hyper-focus on gaming allows it to still run new games smoothly 5 years later. It's just that the Steam Deck runs a full, unrestricted Linux distro right out of the box. Would I replace one of my laptops with it? No, but it's still incredibly useful. Nonetheless, still, like I said, those are easy comparisons. As you think through them, you're going to quickly know what system fits best. In a similar way that you wouldn't buy a 3DS to play PS Vita games, you wouldn't buy a Switch to run OBS. Let's consider the gray area between those obvious points. Specifically, when we want to play non-emulated games that could feasibly be purchased for either system. We're talking Monster Hunter Rise, Bayonetta, or a game I've been playing a ton recently, Temtem. Even a year ago, the decision to buy these games for Switch was kinda obvious for someone who wants to play away from their house. When I backed Temtem over 2 years ago on Kickstarter, it was a no-brainer to get it for Switch over other platforms because it just made sense to want a portable version of the Pokemon-inspired game. Now I have both the Switch version and the early access Steam version, and it's actually pretty difficult to choose which version I enjoy more. And as for why that is, let's start by just looking at the hardware itself. The Switch OLED I typically play on is pretty much the nicest feeling console Nintendo's ever produced. It's the pricier Switch, but the cool metal feel is always super satisfying. The same goes for that lovely OLED display, which never ceases to add just a tad bit extra punch to the game's visuals. Its smaller size and overall flatness also make it super easy to pack in a bag or leave lying around the house without taking too much space. That does come at the cost of some ergonomics though. Back during my review of the Switch OLED, I put in 8 hours straight of playing Let's Go Eevee in Handheld, and my hands felt quite a bit cramped after the fact. That cramped feeling during extended gameplay hasn't really gone away. It's just to the point where I've actually purchased an extra grip to add some comfort. Comparatively, the Steam Deck is downright comfy. A little big on occasion? Sure, but my hands don't typically feel cramped when I've played it for hours at a time, unless I hold it at an odd angle for a while or something. When using it, it always feels great to just hold, especially with its larger, more nuanced control scheme. Even if I could see it not being for everyone, the layout feels perfect for a Steam controller fan like me. Certainly far beyond the small buttons of the Switch's Joy-Cons. Where its size becomes detrimental is when packing it away. It tends to take up more room in a bag compared to the Switch, and a lot more room on our living room table when not in use. The larger screen, while nice enough, doesn't really compare to the impact of the Switch OLED's display either. Even when compared to the LCD of my OG Switch, the most advantage the Steam Deck has is that it's much, much bigger. There's this feeling of balance between the two. One's smaller and much more premium feeling, while the other's more comfortable with a larger feeling viewing experience. Choosing between the two often feels like deciding how I want to feel while playing a game at any point in time. That is, unless I want to increase graphics quality. If you've missed all of our other videos on the Steam Deck, the shortened version is that it's a ton more powerful than the Nintendo Switch. If I'm looking to play a game with the best possible graphics or frame rate available for a handheld, the Steam Deck will most likely be the victor. No competition. It should surprise no one to hear that games can consistently be said to play better on the Steam Deck with smoother, higher quality graphics. Both systems still have a 720p-ish screen, Yeah, but the internals of the Steam Deck allow it to make the most out of what it has with just a few tweaks in a game's video settings. When playing handheld, that's actually not always what I'm looking for though. Higher quality graphics draw more power from the chip, which generates more heat, louder fans, and a smaller battery life. On a road trip, or in a coffee shop, I don't want to push the system hard enough that I'm hunting for a way to charge it sooner. I think Nintendo fundamentally understood this with the limitations placed on the Switch's performance. Playing the same game across both systems at similar settings, the Switch still feels like it has a slight edge for battery life. And psychologically speaking, there's no feeling of missing out because I didn't enable a setting I know the system could technically handle. And sure, the Steam Deck could technically be fine-tuned to nerf its graphics to squeeze out just even a tiny bit more battery life, but that feels like a bigger compromise to the experience for just a little bit more game. That's to the Steam Deck's detriment when the Switch's OLED display outclasses its IPS panel every single time. The darker blacks and punchier colors of an OLED make a larger difference than you might think, particularly in more colorful games like Temtem. The Switch port of Temtem runs at an equivalent of medium settings at 30 FPS, which sounds less ideal compared to the Steam Deck's Ultra settings at slightly higher frame rates, but I consistently want to go back to the Switch version just because it looks better. Side by side, the Steam Deck looks smoother, but more faded, like it's been left out in the sun for a bit too long. It's far from unplayable, but it's just one more way the Switch appears to slightly edge out the Steam Deck for handheld gaming. Add in the advantages of physical game cards and an integrated kickstand, and the Switch makes a very strong case for itself as a lightweight, travel-friendly console, above and beyond what the Steam Deck offers. While the Steam Deck makes a ton of sense around the house, close to an outlet, the Switch feels best as something I can more easily take with me without worrying about messing with my game or system settings to prolong its life. I'd just, in general, recommend buying an extra grip to go along with it to avoid hand cramps. Where everything starts to shift dramatically in the Steam Deck's favor is when docked. Basically, everything is better on the Steam Deck in every way except for design. Let me explain. The Switch's dock is packed in the box with the standard and OLED Switch models. Its slotted design works incredibly well and makes it easy to connect and disconnect a Switch from a television with very little thought. Plus, while not everyone's favorite controller, being able to disconnect the Joy-Cons after docking never leaves me wondering where I placed a controller or if my controller is actually charged. It's been an excellent addition to my living room setup for the past 5+ years. The downside is really the performance. While the newer dock does come with an HDMI 2.0 port, allowing for hypothetical 4K 60 outputs, the Switch itself can only handle up to 1080p 60. Unfortunately, that's probably for the best overall, considering that the console struggles to even reach that resolution frame rate combo for many games, even for launch titles. Performance in general does improve on the Switch when docked, since the system's able to draw just a little bit more power. However, the differences aren't often huge, beyond a slight resolution boost and some added stability. Like, don't get me wrong, it's often a comfortable experience. I've probably put thousands of hours into Switch games at this point, with a ton of that time spent docked. But it feels like one of the more dated aspects of the Switch's playing experience. In an age of ray tracing home consoles dreaming of 4K 120 gameplay, it's harder to justify dedicating an HDMI port on my TV to something that looks better when played handheld. By contrast, when docked, the Steam Deck feels like a full-fledged competitor to my desktop computer. For gaming at least. Now, a dock doesn't come with the Steam Deck, and to be honest, the $89 official dock that's finally starting to ship might be a bit too expensive for most people. Luckily, there are a huge swath of cheaper options available to choose from. So far, my favorite is this all-metal dock sent to us by iVoler. Check out the video description for a link, by the way. At $49, it has a quality heft to it, along with all the ports I really need to use on a more typical laptop dock. Gigabit Ethernet, 3 USB 3.0 ports, USB-C spec'd for 100 watt charging with power delivery, and importantly, an HDMI 2.0 port. Many USB-C docks I've seen floating around Amazon tend to either be a lot more expensive or lack one part of the equation. But the Steam Deck can actually make use of all that connectivity, and I often find myself needing all of that connectivity. Unlike the Switch, the Steam Deck can actually drive a 4K display at reasonable quality and frame rates. Having the extra ports to connect a keyboard, mouse, Steam controller, or any other device also means that players aren't required to play every game with the same control scheme. In general, that means more accessible gameplay tailored to a player's individual needs. Hell, even having a speedy Ethernet port makes more sense here. Sure, like the Switch, online gameplay is going to be more stable, but it also means better cloud gaming and remote play performance. That means that even games not technically compatible with SteamOS could be streamed more reliably from a different PC or Xbox cloud gaming. Versatility and comfort are really the heart of what makes a docked Steam Deck stand out compared to a docked Switch. While a docked Switch feels like a nice way to play Switch games on a larger TV, a docked Steam Deck feels every bit like attaching a laptop to a second monitor. The Steam Deck's gonna play the same whether docked or undocked, but all the extra connections just allow it to do its job a little easier and increase its utility far and beyond the scope of what Nintendo would envision for the Switch. Really, the only downsides are that the Steam Deck takes more space, making it more difficult to fit into my living room setup next to my PS5 or Xbox Series X. And the Steam Deck docks also aren't quite as seamless or aesthetically appealing as Nintendo's purpose-built Switch docks. I do love the look of the iVoler dock, but it's hard to compete with a duo of products designed to fit each other exactly. In the same sense, it might come down to a preference of form or function here, though you'd have to really ignore the gulf in performance between the two machines to pick the Switch. After looking at the physicality of the devices, the handheld gameplay experience, and the docked experience, where does that leave us? For me, it actually outlines clear use cases for each device, and why, or when, I might consider getting a game for one over the other. If I'm about to go on a road trip, or want to play a game while outside, just in general, the Switch OLED just makes more sense. It takes up less space overall, will net me similar battery life at similar performance compared to the Steam Deck, and the OLED screen is just nicer to stare at for longer periods of time. Physical games also make a huge difference. Individual game cards take up very little room and narrow the scope of what I'm choosing to play on a trip, so that I'm not spending a ton of time picking between potential options. It also really helps to supplement the 64 gigabytes of onboard memory and 128 gigabytes of microSD I have installed. Yes, my Steam Deck has 4 times the internal storage and a much larger microSD, and I could technically buy various smaller microSD cards to function like game cards, but that doesn't feel as great, and I don't often need a ton of options while not at home. Plus, while Valve has been making respectable updates to make offline gaming easier for Steam Deck users, lack of internet connectivity can still make the overall gaming experience through Steam kind of rough, or at least rougher than on a Switch. When at home though, it's an entirely different situation. Battery life is basically a non-issue. Internet is free-flowing, and being paralyzed by choice is just the reality of having a large game collection. Without any restrictions, I want to have the best possible experience I can get playing a game. And that calls for a Steam Deck. Whether I want to play handheld or docked to a larger display, the Steam Deck blows the Switch out of the water for me. If I'm about to buy a game for the Switch over the Steam Deck, in that context, it'd have to be because I find the Switch OLED aesthetically pleasing, or I want to add the physical game to my collection. Otherwise, the Steam Deck just kind of makes more sense in general. Ultimately, it seems like context matters the most. Where do I want to play the game? How do I want to experience the game? It's all very subjective, but I think I've landed at a place where I'd likely buy a game for Switch if I wanted to play it on a trip, assuming that the Switch port is actually good in the first place. But otherwise, try to get it for Steam if I wanted to play handheld just anywhere else. Those are my thoughts though. Feel free to leave yours down in the comments. I'd love to read how y'all are personally thinking through having access to multiple handheld platforms these days. It's so nice. And you know, reading through responses and posts on Twitter, it seems like some folks might be just using their Switch for exclusives these days, or collecting the physical version of a game might matter most in some cases. It definitely does to me for a series I really enjoy. But yeah, I'd love to read more about what you guys are thinking. If y'all want to watch more videos on mobile tech in the future, remember to get subscribed. Also, click that like button if you happen to enjoy this walkthrough of my thought process as I juggle electronics. For more videos like this, consider looking back at our first Switch Steam Deck comparison video we did back when the Steam Deck was first announced. And yeah, that's all for this video. Until next time, catch you later.